Alright, class, I thought I'd make another video to introduce this week, and the purpose of this week really is to discuss the elements and importance of task-centered learning. So we are learning about models and tools that can help us to choose resources and tools that we might use for educational purposes. And so one of those models that we can use is task-centered learning. And we learned last week a little bit more about instructional design. And now on to task-centered learning. By the way, up in, I think it's February 2nd, there's a models and tools presentation due. So not until then, and you probably don't need to start working on it yet. But this asks you to explain a little bit about all of the models that you've been learning. So the ADDIE model, for instance, that we learned about last week. This week is task-centered learning, and next week is the SAMR model. So make sure that you pay attention to what you are learning these weeks, because you're going to be asked to create a presentation summarizing those models, telling the major aspects of them, and show how it might guide your choice of technological tools for use for teaching and learning. And so that's something that is coming up, and I'll introduce that in more detail probably next week. This week, however, all you have to do is some readings. So you'll start with the readings that we have listed here. And of course those are on task-centered learning, this idea of task-centered learning. So you'll read First Principles of Instruction from M. David Merrill. He talks about how, what are the basic principles of instruction, especially effective, efficient, and engaging instruction. And then next is what is task-centered learning, and that's something that I wrote about task-centered learning. The same idea of First Principles and task-centered learning have a lot of overlap, and then how task-centered learning differs from problem-based learning. Another article that I wrote with Dr. Gardner from another institution about these topics. So try to get a feel as you read those of what this whole task-centered learning thing is. And then some presentations from M. David Merrill will be what you watch on engaging instruction and on instructional design, to see kind of where he's coming from when he writes about First Principles of Instruction and this whole branch of thinking called task-centered learning. And then based on the readings for this week, you're going to post in a discussion board on what is task-centered learning. How could you create a task-centered learning experience for your own classes or learning situations? And then you'll post an initial response, and then respond to 2 or more other students' posts by the end of the week. So that's basically the activities for this week, is to really get into depth on task-centered learning and understanding what this concept is. Just a little bit about Remind. So make sure that you go to the home page if you have not yet. I need everybody to join Remind in our class. And so right here is a link under Welcome to ELRN /550. I'm going to close this one. And click on Remind, this join link, and join our class in Remind. That way I can communicate with you, and I don't have to use this news tool in D2L anymore. I'd rather not use the D2L news or D2L email to communicate for this class, so I need everybody on Remind. One problem, though, that Remind has just informed me about is that if you're a Verizon cell phone user, you won't receive texts from Remind if you have a Verizon network cell phone. And so what you'll probably have to do then is sign up again, but use your email address instead, so that it informs you by email of the different announcements that I share. Hopefully Remind can work this issue out with Verizon, but this is one of those things that happens in the technology world where maybe different companies don't get along. Anyway, so make sure you do sign up for Remind. I need everybody on there so that I can communicate with you all just in Remind exclusively and not anywhere else. And it makes it just a lot easier for us to communicate back, because you can always reply and it will always get to where it needs to go, except for that Verizon issue like I mentioned. Alright, so this week the goal is to discuss the elements and importance of task-centered learning. I'm going to pull up one of the articles just to introduce this to you a little bit. What is task-centered learning? And again, like I said, this is something that I wrote for Tech Trends, one of the top journals in educational technology. And it's kind of comparing or synthesizing the different models from task-centered learning to problem-based learning. But what I wanted to pull out is these different elements, these different elements of what is exactly task-centered learning. And I think there's a good, there we go. There's a nice little illustration at the bottom. It says place illustration or place figure 1 about here, but then it links down to the bottom. That's kind of how publishing works. You have to place sometimes the figures at the bottom. Anyway, task-centered learning means that learning is centered on real-world tasks. So we're not talking about fake world tasks. We're talking about trying to make educational or learning tasks as close as possible to real-world performance and engaging learners at the task level, meaning that they're doing a whole task, not just a little piece of a task too, and having learners complete a progression of tasks. So meaning that they'll start with with kind of a smaller, maybe easier task, and then go on to the next one and so forth. So let's say that they're learning about, let's see that they're going to do an experiment in a science class using a hypothesis. And in this experiment, again, that's the real-world task that they're centering their learning on. They're going to have to conduct their own experiment. It's not that they're going to be learning about an experiment somebody else did, or that they're going to be reading about an experiment that has been done, or what would come, or thinking about an experiment that has been, but it's like a real-world task. They're actually doing the experiment. So that's one of the big differences between task-centered learning and most learning that actually happens in education, is that it's actual students getting to be involved in the actual activity that is like a real-world activity that someone in the real world might do outside of school. So around this task, you have these 4 elements. You have activation, you have demonstration, you have application, and integration. And so activation is the first one we always mention. It means that you need to activate your learners' cognitive structures prior to learning. And you need to connect. Basically what that means is let's connect what they're learning to what they already know. And if they don't already know enough to start the task, then they need to be able to acquire the necessary cognitive structures. In other words, they need to acquire the background knowledge that they need to complete the task or to get started. So that would be one thing. This is all centered around a task, though. Remember, it all has to be connected to the real-world task of this experiment that they're going to do. Next is demonstration, and that means that the teacher shows skills and information that is relevant to the task and uses relevant media and multiple representations of concepts. In other words, the instructor is going to demonstrate how the task is to be done and provide students with background information and other kinds of information that will help them to understand and do the task. And it's modeling too. It's modeling. It's showing them what to do, what are the steps, here's what to do next, here are some things to watch out for, and that type of thing. Next is application. And in this phase, the instructor moves from just showing to having students do. So in application, the instructor will coach learners, meaning help them out and give them information and so forth, as the learners themselves apply the information that they've learned to complete tasks. So this is the action part. The learners do the action, they do the thing. And then the instructor will reduce coaching and feedback as learners gain expertise, and they apply knowledge to various tasks. So that's an important part of task-centered learning, is that the learners are actually doing the real-world task. Now, how real-world the task is, well, it might depend on how ready are the learners to do the task, right? If they're young kids, they might not be able to do this messy experiment that's a real-world task. It might have to be simplified for them before they're going to do it. But if they're advanced learners, they might be able to do something very similar to what is done in the real world. And then finally, integration. And in integration, learners demonstrate their new knowledge and skill and find new ways to use their new knowledge and skill. So if they've completed the experiment, for instance, they might actually think about ways that it could be used in different areas and understand how it might apply to different situations and so forth. So the idea with tasks is to complete a progression of these. So that means that you might be doing 2 or 3 types of experiments, let's say, and demonstrating activation, demonstration, application, and integration might happen for each one of those tasks. And then students might gain this expertise that helps them to be, again, learning efficiently, learning in an engaged way, and an effective way. So that's really what task-centered learning is all about, but you'll read more in depth about it as you go along. But be thinking about how in education today, it's very different from this model in a lot of ways. A lot of people read this and they say, oh no, task-centered learning, we do that all the time. Well, not really. If you look at how task-centered learning tells you to do things, these need to be real-world tasks. It can't just be something that is kind of contrived or made up. For instance, the old math problems where a train is traveling from Chicago and another train is traveling from Denver, and when will they pass each other if this train's going this fast and this train's going that fast, and there's 300 miles between Chicago and Denver. For instance, that's kind of a contrived task. Nobody's going to be doing that in the real world. You're not going to sit down in a train and say, well, how soon will we pass that other train that's coming this other way? So be thinking more real world than most education problems are. And then also be thinking about how activation, demonstration, application, and integration can be supported around a task. So I think that's about it for this week as you get ready to learn about task-centered learning. This is hopefully a good intro to that concept and how task-centered learning fits into things. And I think that's about it. So good luck getting started for this week, and I'll keep communicating with you in Remind and also on the discussions.